I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Nicholas Christakis. He is the Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University, where he directs the Human Nature Lab. Dr. Christakis is a sociologist and physician who's an expert in social network analysis and also the author of Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, among other books. Nicholas, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Adam, thank you so much for having me.
I'd love a brief overview of social network analysis. The first thing that comes to mind, I think, for many people is social networks like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, but it's pretty different from that. It's a mathematical technique that could apply, that people have been doing that type of research even before social media networks existed.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like the average person when you hear about social networks thinks about social media, but actually our propensity to form networks, human social networks, is very ancient. It goes back tens of thousands of years. And the kinds of networks I'm interested in are face-to-face networks. As I said, the ones we and our primate ancestors have been making for a very long period of time. And if anything, these modern technologies that we have, ranging back to the telephone for sure, and the telegram and social media and the internet, all of those modern technologies are grafted onto these more ancient proclivities that we have, which proclivities, by the way, are to form friendships. In other words, most people listening to this have the intuitive understanding that our species, like other species that reproduce sexually, chooses our mates. We like many other species have sex with each other. But we do something that is really weird in the animal kingdom, which is that we befriend each other. We form long-term, non-reproductive unions to unrelated conspecifics. Namely, we have friends. And that's a very uncommon phenotype. We do it, certain other primates do it, certain cetacean species do it, and elephants do it. And therefore, this desire that we have for friendship, to form these affiliative ties with unrelated people that endure across time and which are mutually supportive, each of us, all of us have this desire. And so as a result, we assemble ourselves into these ornate networks where every dot in the network is a person, and the lines between the dots represent social relationships. And you get this intricate, ornate pattern. And then we proceed to live out our lives within this thing that we created collectively, just like ants live out their lives in anthills that they've, created collectively. And our fate in life depends a lot on these networks that we make. So yes, that's what I've been studying for the last, 25 years.
There's a lot of interesting overlap between these types of social network simulations and game theory, evolutionary game theory, and the types of friendships that you described emerging.
Oh no, these aren't simulations. These are real. These aren't simulations. These are real networks, right? I mean, one can also one can also simulate networks using mathematical model. One can say, imagine there's a distribution of probability that every person will form a connection to some other person in a population. And that naturally gives rise, that probability distribution and the interaction process naturally gives rise to certain networks with certain structures. That's a simulation. You can simulate what happens on networks or how networks affect different phenomena. But actually the modern state of the science is much more empirical. We know what these networks actually look like. And my group and other groups have fanned out across the world, for example, to map human social networks. I mean, here's a claim that's interesting. We've mapped the mathematical structure, the topology of networks in settings as diverse as slated Honduran villages, Ugandan villages, urban poor communities in Mumbai in India, many settings in the United States, amongst the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, amongst the Nyangatom agropastoralists in Sudan. And in all of these places, when we map these networks, these human social networks, they have the same mathematical structure. And the reason for this, of course, is natural selection. Natural selection has shaped us to have this propensity for friendship. It's a kind of universal. And so therefore, the fundamental structure of these networks that we give rise to through all of us individually choosing our friends and so on is very similar. And as you were putting on the table another set of ideas, I interrupted you to talk about the simulation point, but the other point
Hmm.
you were about to make, I think, is correct, which is that there is a connection between our propensity for friendship, our proclivity rather for friendship, and the structure of the networks we made. Those phenomena, our proclivity for friendship and the mathematical structure of the networks we made, are actually also connected to our ability to cooperate with each other, our ability to work together to solve collective action problem is abetted by these other phenomena that we just discussed.
Right. I've pieced together this history of how the field might have emerged. I don't know how much of it is true, but my understanding is that the game theory research was done much earlier, before social network analysis was developed. And you can ask, say, simpler questions like, is it adaptive to make friends to begin with, or to ever behave altruistically? Why would you make a sacrifice? And you can do these types of simulations to see that in certain scenarios, it maps out that behaving cooperatively, it's actually not a zero-sum game. The whole species might benefit from doing that. And then once you have a species that can be cooperative, like us and like certain other primates, then you can ask the more interesting narrow questions about what do those relationships look like the strength of relationships, who has how many relationships, what predicts how influential you are within a social network, and asking those questions that are building on the foundation of the game theory type questions is where social network analysis comes in. Does that sound right?
Yes and no. I mean, there's the whole intellectual history of these ideas, and I would say that the focus on structural arrangements of humans anteceded uh, game theory historically. Now, it did not antecede a focus on cooperation. Darwin is interested in altruistic behavior and in cooperation in animal species. And of course, this was a big conundrum for the early evolutionary biologists. There's a lot of work 100 years ago by a variety of thinkers on kinship selection, on kin selection, on the origins of altruistic action. Altruism was a serious challenge, to the classic Darwinian paradigm. So, in that sense, the emergence of an interest in networks and the emergence of a concern for altruism were roughly coterminous historically. They all they were there already about 100 years ago. But in terms of formal game theory, that was a much later invention. I mean, people were studying formalism of networks, well, beginning with Georg Simmel in the 1890s, who started speaking of triads, and then you have Jacob Marino in the 1930s, who already draws detailed social networks in his path-breaking book, Who Shall Survive? This was in the 1930s. And certainly by the 1950s, you're already getting quite a lot of people drawing pictures of networks, thinking structurally, developing ideas such as that the enemy of your friend should be your enemy and the friend of your enemy should be your enemy, and so on, these triadic simple arrangements. So in terms of whether networks or game theory came first, I would say networks. But in terms of the connection of the ideas and the deep relationship between altruism and cooperation on the one hand and friendship on the other, there is actually quite a deep connection. But I would not say that I wouldn't presume to say which of them came first. In other words, I wouldn't think that cooperation came first and then we had friendship, or friendship came first and then we had cooperation. They actually interdepend on each other. And there are aspects of friendship which don't have anything to do with cooperation. For example, the evolved capacity to remember who your friends are. So we all of us have this ability to track our friends, to first of all uniquely identify other members of our species, this capacity to signal and detect unique identity. And this is only required if you have a relationship across time that's important. If you're a baby and you need to be able to signal to your mother, this is me, take care of me and no one else. Or if you want to be able to remember to whom to repay your debts or whom to avoid, you have to be able to signal your unique identity, and the other person has to be able to track it. And this capacity, which is again a predicate for friendship connections, is distinct from this altruistic and this altruism that we manifest with our friends. Sorry about the background noise there. There's someone mowing the lawn all of a sudden.
Oh, I don't hear it. It's all good. So
Good.
the mother-infant bond example made me think of oxytocin, being a hormones researcher myself, and that made me think of two ways this social network could be instantiated from an evolutionary perspective. Because there's sort of the detached modeling perspective, like this is the underlying truth, but the organisms don't actually have to be aware of it as long as there's some way to form a social
Yeah, just
tie.
like the ants.
Right,
Yeah, just like the
exactly.
ants going about their business still give rise to an ant colony. That's right. There's no master ant that knows the structure of the thing they're going to build and orders everyone else around. Correct.
And then humans are unique because we're both. Not only are we operating under these evolutionary principles and social principles, but we also can mentally simulate it and map out what is a social network. And all of these constructs that we have, often people don't think about them scientifically, like popularity, is that a scientific construct? But from this social network analysis perspective, you can actually quantify something like that, how much influence one has over a network or centrality.
Yes, although you're right that of course as thinking beings we can both instantiate evolutionary processes and articulate them. And of course we do. But that itself is also a relatively recent uh, phenomenon in the life of our species. 100,000 years ago, I'm not sure how much we were thinking about networks and talking about networks with other people. Um, so, and furthermore, there are other animals. Interestingly, for example, if you map elephant networks, and our last common ancestor with elephants was 85 or 90 million years ago, if you map elephant networks, the mathematical structure of those networks, and by the way, certain other properties of networks, for instance, homophily, the fact that we tend to befriend people we resemble, elephants do the same thing. Or reciprocity, the fact that when I say you are my friend, you are more likely to say that I am your friend. Elephants also seem to have that. Um, or the thing we talked about earlier, this capacity for individual identity. Um, there's evidence that elephants can track the vocalizations of 150 other elephants. They can recognize from sound who is where. So so all of those other phenomena evolved in these other social, intelligent, long-lived social mammals like us as well. So my point is that yes, you're right. We can, in a meta way, speak about these things, but they would have occurred anyway, and they regarded. And and part of the evidence for this is that these other mammals that don't think about it the same way we do also do these same thing. I don't know if I was
Mhm.
made myself clear about that.
I'm thinking of an analogy to the people who are big fans of Bayesian reasoning, and they'll say that implicitly everything is Bayesian, even something as simple as perception. Your brain is under the hood doing all of these Monte Carlo simulations and sampling
Uh-huh.
different distributions from what you're perceiving and then generating a likely prediction for what's going on. And intuitively, we have perceptions of something like, again, popularity is a good example. I'm wondering, do we know anything about at the neural level? Is the brain doing something similar to this type of mathematical social network analysis to make an assessment
Yes.
of? Mhm.
Yeah, I think the brain is. I think we do form cognitive maps. Well, first of all, I think we do form cognitive maps of geographic space, and there's a lot of study, including MRI studies, that try to ascertain the degree to which people hold in their mind images of space around them. And I think we probably use those same brain regions to hold in our minds images of social space. And in fact, in some new work in my lab with Eric Feltham, a graduate student of mine, now postdoc, we have been thinking about social cognition in this way, like how we cognize social networks. In other words, people have third party knowledge. I don't just know who my friends are. I know who other people are friends with, even people who are not my friends. So I might not be friends with Tom and Dick, but I might neither be friends with Tom nor with Dick, but I know whether Tom and Dick are friends. We have this kind of third party knowledge. And by the way, we know from experiments, even infants, human infants can have such third party insight, and other primates. So as soon as you have that basic capacity, which by the way confers a survival advantage. I mean, being able to track who's whose friend, who might come to whose defense. Now, if I'm thinking of attacking Tom, but gee, I know that Dick and Harry are Tom's friends, and Dick and Harry are really big, and maybe I shouldn't attack Tom, right? That's like valuable cognition to have. But from the moment people have that, then you can imagine that they're able to form in their mind a map, a cognitive map of the social network in which they are embedded, just like they might form a cognitive map of the social space in which they are embedded. And so I suspect that is the case. And we have some new work in the lab that we've been pursuing, that we're about to submit, that explores some of these ideas. So I forgot how we got off onto this tangent. What did you say? You forgot how
We're
we
talking
how we
about the
wanted.
mental simulation. Is the brain actually
Oh,
modeling the same way you model?
yeah, I think the brain is modeling networks in some way. Um, And we've done some work on the evolutionary biology of this. We've shown, for instance, that using, for example, twin studies, we've shown that same-sex dizygotic twins compared to monozygotic twins, that the structure of the friendship networks of monozygotic twins is more similar than the structure of the friendship network of same-sex dizygotic twins, and that there's something about whether you like, so for example, things like how many friends you have is partially heritable. So, but that's not very surprising. Some people are born shy, some people are born gregarious. People vary in their taste for friendship, and that genes play a role in that is not a shocker. But we also found that certain higher order properties of your position in social networks is heritable. For example, whether your friends are friends with each other depends not just on those people's genes, but on your genes. If you have Tom, Dick, and Harry in a room, whether Dick is friends with Harry depends not just on Dick's genes or on Harry's genes, but on Tom's genes. So that's a very bizarre result. And we think the reason for this is that people vary in their tendency to introduce their friends to each other. So
Mhm.
Tom has genes that make him want to introduce Dick and Harry to each other, and Susie does not have genes that make her want to introduce Betty and Jane to each other. So you can now begin to realize that as there is genetic heterogeneity in a population in how many friends people want, uh, whether they introduce their friends to each other. Another phenotype is whether you prefer popular or unpopular friends. You might want 4 friends, and I might want 4 friends. That might be our how gregarious, our genetic propensity to be gregarious. But you might want 4 friends who have many friends, and I might want 4 friends who have few friends. Both of those could be advantageous. If I have, if you have friends, if your friends have many friends, that might give you better access to information about predators or prey in the environment, for example, because each of your friends in turn has many sources of information. So you might get back higher quality or variety of information. On the other hand, you having many friends might mean they have less time for you. They're distracted by all their other friends. Whereas I might prefer to have same number of friends as you, but I want my friends to be unpopular. So they give me all of their attention, for example. So there's heterogeneity in this predilection. We also showed using this twin study design. This paper was published like 15 years ago. And then in follow-on studies, we looked at whether people not only vary in their desire for friendship along the lines I've just discussed, but whether there was some kind of evolutionary shaping of the kind of friends we pick. So in other words, you might there there might be a way in which we are compelled to pick certain kinds of people as our friends. That one of the findings in that work was that people tended to be pick as their friends individuals who resemble them on a genetic level at roughly the third or fourth cousin level. So these are not individuals who are actually your third or fourth cousins. I put you in a group of 1,000 people and I say, Adam, go pick someone as your friend. of those 1,000 people, you are more likely to befriend someone who is roughly third or fourth cousin genetically dissimilar or similar to you. And
Mhm.
and there are some reasons to imagine why this might be advantageous. And those individuals resemble you, but they're not your cousins. So you have identity by state, not identity by descent. They're not actually your cousins. And the reason for this is that it's, it's kind of not misfiring is not the right word. It's the kind of application of a kinship detection system in humans. It's like you're picking your friends who are as if they were your kin, but they're not really your kin, but you can't help it because you evolved to be nice to your kin, to
Mhm.
befriend your kin. So if you have this tendency to be altruistic and pay a price to benefit your kin, and now you're going out and looking for who are my kin, and you look at all these people, you say, these are candidate kin. They're not actually my kin, but it's as if they were my kin. I'm going to help them, i.e., I'm going to be their friend. Anyway, so I'm digressing on a digression, but we've done a lot of work to explore the evolutionary foundation of this very profound phenotype, which is friendship.
Now, I'm imagining that ever since industrialization and globalization, whatever initial source of genetic variant there is in these social network formation, it's only magnified. Where right now I can have someone who lives across the street from me with an entirely different social network in a town of 100,000 people, and we don't know each other, even though we're in really close distance. But then evolutionary psychologists talk about we evolved in the context of hunter-gatherer societies where with 150 people, everyone knows everyone. And I know you've done this modeling work on hunter-gatherers as well in smaller societies, like you mentioned, and that there's still, I assume, plenty of variance if you live with 150 people, whether your best friend or your best five friends are any, you can imagine a whole bunch of different subsets there. So I'm sure the modeling different works, but still works. But could we comment on the differences between doing it in those smaller scale societies versus what it looks like when you live in a large town and no one might know 99% of the population?
Well, it's a little bit like, we these proclivities that we have been shaped across great sweeps of time. And, we only invented agriculture now 10,000 years ago, and cities, 7 or 8,000 years ago, and telecommunications, depending on whether you treat the printed word as telecommunications or not, 500 years ago. And so I don't think, or less, I mean, depends if you count the phone or the internet as telecommunications. But anyway, uh, so so we are living in a modern environment, which is very dissimilar than the one we evolved to live in. And I would answer your question by reference to what we observed with the case of obesity. We evolved these tastes for sweet and fatty and salty foods when those were scarce and precious nutrients. And now they're available very plentifully, but that doesn't mean that our bodies have adapted. And so we have whatever tendencies we had towards friendship, and now we live in cities. And we manifest those tendencies in an environment that's radically different. But it doesn't fundamentally change. I mean, one of the things that's important to realize is sort of a toy example I give of this idea is that my Greek grandmother, who was born very poor in a village in the south of Greece, if you she's been long dead, but if you could go back and ask her what her life was like when she was a 10 or 11-year-old girl, she would have said, I have one or two best friends, and four or five of us girls hang out together in this little village in southern Greece. And if you ask my daughter Eleni the same question, she's now 26, but when she was 10 or 11, 15 years ago, you asked her the same question, she would have given you the same answer. One or two girls are my best friend, four or five of us girls hang out together, even though she has an iPhone in her pocket. So this technology, the iPhone and the social media and everything else, that changes many things, but there's some fundamental things that doesn't change at all, such as our taste for friendship, our capacity for friendship. It's not like inventing this technology suddenly made us have 100 best friends or 10
Mhm.
best friends. Most of us still only have one or two best friends, and it has been unchanged for, millennia.
That's an interesting paradox to me because one thought would be that you grow up evolutionarily, we evolved in these small group societies, so you get to know everyone, and then suddenly you take that evolved brain and you plant it in a large city, and maybe we'd have this impulse to get to know everyone, and you run around like a puppy trying to say hi to every stranger. But in fact, you see the opposite. Like now people are dealing with loneliness. You're surrounded by a whole bunch of people. You see this at larger universities as well. People say, I'm surrounded by hundreds of people every single day, and I feel lonelier than ever than when I was in this really small school, small town.
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic sociological observation. There's a famous book called The Lonely Crowd. Um, and it also goes all the way back to some classic ideas in sociology to Max Weber and others, which is that in addition to the scale of our societies, we've also created bureaucratic and institutionalized norms or roles. So you don't interact any longer with other human beings as distinct individuals. You interact with them as if you're a interchangeable widget. In other words, you interact with someone who's a clerk at a store, and you're the customer and they're the clerk. You're not interacting, I, Adam, with clerk Robert face to face as unique human beings. You have these sort of faceless, anonymous interactions, which our evolved psychology actually treats as very unsatisfying and very maybe even dangerous, right? Because in the ancestral world, encountering someone who didn't really know you was a potential threat. So these kind of anonymous interactions, these faceless interactions we have in these, which is coincident with this growth in scale. So it's not just that we live in larger populations, it's that we have developed modernity. We have all of these other ways in which we interact with each other that are faceless, where you are not treated as a unique person who is known by the people with whom you interact. And that mostly people find that unpleasant. It's like living your life in the DMV, the motor vehicles, it's like, I don't like it. I'm stuck in this bureaucracy and no one is really listening to me and to my character problems. So
So then again, you might think to correct that, everyone would want to personally attend to everyone. Is it something like a cognitive load problem? It just takes too much working memory to keep track of everyone and have a network of thousands of people?
yes, that's correct. And actually, we have good reason to believe that that exact constraint also shaped our evolutionary past. So, for example, one of the arguments I make in Blueprint is here's another toy example. So imagine you have a population of 1,000 people, and you tell everyone in this population, be nice to everyone else, just be altruistic. Well, that's a really serious challenge because you might be nice to someone and you might never interact with them again. So you've been kind to them, but there's never any reciprocity. You don't get it. And you'd have to track all of these 1,000 people, which is also cognitively demanding. And so what typically happens in that type of a situation, that kind of amorphous, unstructured population of 1,000, is that you find levels of cooperation are low. So in fact, people don't cooperate with each other when they are put in ever larger groups for a host of reasons, including low likelihood of re-encountering someone that you've been kind to in the past, difficulty in tracking who is who, and so on. But imagine if we could evolve a simple expedient, which is to give everyone a little flag, take this group of 1,000 people and break it up into 10 groups of 100, where some people are holding a purple flag and some people are holding an orange flag and some people are holding a green flag and so on. And now you tell everyone in the population of 1,000, you know what? Just be nice to the people that are carrying your color flag. Well, you just in my even describing this to you, you should already be feeling more relaxed. You're like, oh, I can do that. That's just 100 people. I can track 100 people. I don't have to be nice to everyone. I'll just be nice to my smaller group of people that are carrying my color flag. And what you find, what we've done now is we've added structure to the population. We've partitioned it into 10 groups of 100. So we've added some structure. And now that move, all of a sudden you should have the intuition that the level of cooperation in the whole population of 1,000 should go up. So there's a very strong argument that the ability to form and track groups and to preferentially treat members of our group, so-called in-group favoritism or in-group bias, very likely co-evolved with the capacity for cooperation. In fact, they're related. And the ability to distinguish self from other, my group from other groups, probably has a lot to do with our ability to be altruistic towards each other. But this division of 1,000 people into 10 groups of 100 is even simpler than the evolving the capacity for friendship, because another way to add structure to a population is to form it into a network. So now in an amorphous population, every one of 1,000 people has an equal chance of bumping into everyone else in the 1,000. But in a network population, you tell everybody, you're just interacting. Each of you has your own friends, and you only interact with your own friends, and you only have to be nice to your own friends. That's another way of adding structure, to take this group of 1,000 and instead of having it be mixed randomly and completely, have it be mapped into a network. And now people are said, well, just be nice to everyone is told, just be nice to your friends. And this too adds structure to the population, and this too solves the problem of altruism. And so now, once again, you have higher levels of cooperation and altruism and greater group performance when you make this type of change in the population. So all of these things are connected: the capacity for individual identity, cooperation, friendship, in-group bias. In fact, these are all parts of what I call the social suite in Blueprint. And the social suite is a set of evolved phenotypes that we express outside ourselves. So we're talking about phenotypes that require the presence of other people, like love and friendship. We're not talking about loving yourself or befriending yourself or being kind to yourself. We're talking about loving others or befriending others or being kind to others. So all of these things are phenotypes we express interpersonally that have been shaped by natural selection and that are required for well-functioning societies. And finally, related to that is also this phenomenon of social learning, which is that we learn from each other. And this is this capacity for learning, which requires interacting with other human beings so we can learn from them, is also abetted by everything we've discussed so far, and is a miracle in our species. And in fact, this capacity for social learning lies at the root of our capacity for culture, which is the ability to share information across time and place, which ultimately lies at the core of everything about us. Our ascendance as a species over the whole planet, what E.O. Wilson has called a social conquest of the earth, relates to this as well, this capacity for social learning.
In that example of 1,000 people divided into 10 groups, if you're in a group of 100, are you then at the same baseline level of non-cooperation with the remaining 900 people, or is there some necessary outgroup bias trade-off, and you're now treating the other 900 worse compared to the first amorphous?
If I've understood what you've asked, that's a great question. And there's a big debate about this. In other words, does outgroup hatred necessarily go along with in-group liking?
Mm-hmm.
Why not just like our own group and, let's say, be indifferent to the other group? Why do we want to kill them? Why so much hatred in the world? And there's a lot of thinking about this, and I don't know the answer. You would think that it should be possible to evolve the capacity for cooperation and in-group favoritism without the simultaneous existence of out-group hatred, but it's still unclear the extent to which, or let me put it this way. I think that cooperation can evolve merely in the presence of in-group favoritism and out-group neutrality, but there's modeling evidence to suggest that it evolves even more in the presence of out-group hatred, which is a very depressing conclusion.
Right. And from the evolutionary perspective, this could explain why people, if you give them some sort of ultimatum game where it's like you could get an unfair deal, let's say there's $10 to be distributed, and someone says, I keep $9, you get $1. And you might think from the rational economics perspective, hey, it's $1 for free. versus nothing, I might as well take it. But most of the time, people are insulted by that and they reject it. So you could say, objectively, at least in that one instance, you're worse off, but there's a signal to it of, I'm going to be treated worse and I'm not going to allow that. So there's something like a moral intuition that may be co-evolved with that. And I'm imagining the way it connects to the in-group, out-group bias thing is if you treat another group as indifferent and favor your own group, and some resources come along that are going to be distributed, even if they're distributed evenly between in-group and out-group, or even if it's like the out-group could get more, but you still get something, it's not just that both groups benefit, so you're fine. It's like if you assume that everyone increases, but another one increases more, then you're actually lagging behind in terms of, say, reproductive success. So you could objectively gain resources, but relatively lose status and lose reproductive success.
Yes, that's right. And people have done experiments like that, trading off, dictator game situations of the kind you alluded to, and also manipulating whether the person you're interacting with is a member of your own group or a member of some other group. And, do you require higher payoff? Do you reject lower offers from people who are members of the out group? And mostly those experiments line up with the intuitions that you are, describing. So, anyway, it's a vast and interesting, the origins and import of human social interactions, are fascinating to me. And that's what I've been studying. And because we got onto the topic of social learning, you have to understand that social learning is incredibly efficient. Most animals learn through contact with the environment. That's called independent learning. So, those experiments we all learned where you like shock the worm with the electrical thing and it avoids the aversive stimulus and so on. A little fish swimming in the sea can learn that if it swims up to the light, it will find food there. If you put your hand in the fire, you learn that it burns, right? That's independent learning. But I can watch you put your hand in the fire and I will gain almost as much knowledge, but pay none of the price, right? I learned that fire burned, but my hand is unburnt. And this is very efficient. Or we go into the forest and you eat red berries and die. And I learned don't eat red berries. That's extraordinarily efficient from an evolutionary point of view. So there are all these capacities we and other animals have for social learning through mimicry, through imitation, and so on. But our species does something even more remarkable than that, which is we teach each other things. I teach you to build a fire, which is a kind of altruism, by the way. This generous transmission of information from one member of the species to a conspecific, and this is extraordinary and is uncommon. And as I said earlier, this capacity for teaching is what lies at the root of our capacity for culture, but it also can bring us woe, just like the in-group bias is good for cooperation, as we discussed earlier, but can also bring us woe. Teaching can too, because not just good things we teach each other, it's bad things. There's not just good things that spread from person to person, like valuable ideas, but but fascism can spread from person to person. So the deep connection here is that one of the sentences I use to describe this is that in a very real way, the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of ideas. So we form ourselves into networks in order to share information, but then in so doing, we place ourselves at risk for all kinds of bad things, like, for example, the spread of COVID or the spread of Ebola or the spread of other pathogens. So I come near you in order for you to give me ideas, which is good for me. But then when I come near you, you might give me an infection, or you might be violent towards me, or kill me, or fill me with lies. So both good and bad things can spread, you see, in social networks. And in fact, in some other work we've done, we've argued that across evolutionary time, we had to balance the costs versus the benefits of living socially in a particular way that we do. And that, in fact, the network structure that has emerged, that all of us make, these networks that mathematical structure of the networks that we make has actually been shaped by natural selection. So what that means is that love spreads and happiness spreads and ideas spread and kindness spreads, but also violence spreads and hatred spreads and deadly pathogen spreads and misinformation and lies spread. All of these things can spread, good or bad, and sometimes we come to be harmed by this, and we're seeing examples of this around the world today with more powerful communication technologies that make it even easier for us to spread absurd conspiracy theories and so on, and that harm us.
I've wondered from an evolutionary perspective if technological advancement has always only been spurred by whatever top subset of our species. So, for example, we have really smart engineers that developed satellites and smartphones, and we all benefit from it, even though most people couldn't tell you the first thing about the engineering that went into them. And I'm wondering, say, when we first developed fire, do you think it was only, say, the smartest proto-human in the tribe who developed it, but then the others kind of just benefit from it and tag along?
Well, you'd have to ask Richard Rang on that question. I think probably yes, if I had to speculate, but we keep pushing back when we mastered fire. And now it's, I think, over 1 million years ago is the current speculation. And but if I had to guess, I think your theory is probably correct. That there's some way in which innovation is abetted by particularly inventive members of our species. And there's a whole literature, by the way, on how population size affects innovation, because one of the things you have to understand is that if you just need one person to come up with a new idea that's helpful, when you have a larger population, there's obviously a higher probability that at least one person will be able to do that. And furthermore, when there's a larger population, there's more likely to be a nearby student who can learn. So you get more people discovering how to make fire in a population of 1 million than in a population of 10. And that lucky person who figures out how to make fire, that innovation is more likely to be preserved in a bigger population than in a smaller population.
Yeah,
So there's some other, well, anyway, we're studying the topic in the lab as well, but go on.
I've been curious about those species level differences. Like, imagine the 1 in a million genius Homo erectus. Were they as intelligent as an average Homo sapien in the same way that Einstein is this major outlier to us now?
Yeah. I'm sorry, where does that thought experiment take you? Yes, it would be great if we could all be as smart as Einstein.
But wondering, were there people of a different species who were more similar to an average Homo sapien now, but they were just such outliers in their
Probably.
time?
Probably. I mean, there's also these famous experiments with self-recognition in elephants, and that Franz de Waal did. And there was this, I think, the famous case of, forgot the name of the elephant, who was not only able to pass the mirror recognition test, but also able to pass the so-called mark test, where you would, while the elephant was asleep, you would put a little X on their forehead, and then you would put them in front of the mirror, and then they would not only recognize themselves, but have a sense of identity. They would use their trunk to touch the X on their forehead, like, this is me, or open their mouth to suddenly be able, for the first time ever, to explore a part of their body they couldn't see before, but they knew it was their body. I'm opening my mouth because I know this is my mouth. I'd like to see the inside of it. And the argument that Franz de Waal makes is that what he's exploring there is the maximum capacity of the species, not the average capacity. So just because not all humans can do calculus, let alone invent calculus like Newton and Leibniz, we still have the capacity, our species, for calculus. And in some sense, that's what we're trying to attain. So if you're asking me, did some Australopithecus have the capacity to understand networks? Probably. That's different than the general species phenotype.
Another analogy there, there's the ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny idea that within a single human lifespan, you also see cognitive development and brain regions that mature earliest are like sensory motor regions. So, and it parallels those that evolved first. So when you're talking about like abstract social cognition and metacognition, that isn't finished maturing until your late teens or even 20s. And I'm interested in adolescent brain development as a critical period for social cognition and emotion regulation. Many people have argued, and you can show that it's a critical period because there are specific age windows of plasticity. People can experimentally manipulate this in rodents, for example. If you socially isolate them in early childhood and then reintroduce them to peers later during adolescence, brain development continues just fine. If you socially isolate adults, they won't have permanent brain changes. But specifically during this window of adolescence, you see abnormal social interaction can lead to abnormal brain development. And then this also fits with ideas of teenagers being especially sensitive to peer influence and ideas like popularity, and then connecting this to the network analysis idea and what is the brain actually doing to represent this? What do we know about how brain development actively contributes at different ages to the ability to represent social networks? Presumably, children can do it to some extent, but they're more limited in their capacity.
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that certain forms of social network cognition peak in adulthood, you know, decline like with many mental faculties in old age and aren't quite as good in young age. I do know, as I mentioned earlier, some work by other scientists on so-called third-party knowledge, that is, even infants can know that those two don't like each other, those two people like each other. But for broader network representations, I don't know the answer,
Did you see
actually.
Ashley Thomas's science paper last year about saliva sharing and infants who see puppets or humans sharing saliva, they infer thickness in social relationships?
No, I didn't see that paper, but it doesn't surprise me what you just said.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's the standard puppet design. So,
Uh-huh.
infants are able to tell at a very young age, say, if you show two puppets playing together, and then one of them later you show crying, and then there's the original puppet who is pro-social towards them versus a stranger, they'll be surprised if the stranger comes to help before the friendly one. And similarly, if they're fighting, then you see the opposite effect. So the cool thing here was they don't have to be overtly playing together in a pro-social way or fighting, but just doing something like sharing food. But the cool thing about this manipulation was that the hypothesis was that it's specifically something about kissing or food sharing, something specific about saliva, because if they're mimicking the same actions, so like taking their hand and putting it in their mouth or doing something that was action wise basically the same thing, but didn't involve the same sort of social contact of either kissing or food sharing, then the infants cued into that and they expected those relationships to be less close than those who they see sharing food or kissing as opposed to hugging or something like that.
Would you send me that paper in case I forget?
Yeah,
And
will do.
it doesn't really surprise me, but it's interesting and wonderful to hear. We just mapped such kissing networks and food sharing networks in Honduras in some samples that we've been working with. Uh, and for some of the work we are doing on that, I think it'd be nice to see this paper that you're alluding to.
Yeah, will do. I'll also link it in the description for this podcast for our listeners. Okay, so we don't know.
Uh, we just had a paper in Science on May 3rd on social contagion in the population in Honduras that I alluded to that some listeners might want to see as well, where we did a big randomized controlled trial where we took 30,000 people in 176 villages, and we saw whether we could experimentally induce social contagion in diverse practices related to maternal and child health, and showed that it could be done in certain ways. And there are a host of other findings, but that paper provides some meat behind what we've been discussing today in terms of the social contagion ideas. And that was in Science on May 3rd.
The social contagion seems to have negative connotations, but does it also apply to something like adopting a healthy diet or exercise habits or something like that?
Oh God, yes. So So yes, and in fact, I would argue that the spread of desirable properties must necessarily outweigh the spread of undesirable properties, or we wouldn't necessarily be attuned to copy others. So we've looked at social contagion of all kinds of phenomena experimentally. We've looked at the spread of altruism in networks. We've looked at the spread of various maternal and child health behaviors in networks. These experiments we've done. We've looked at the spread of uh, uh, certain eating behaviors in networks, again, experimentally and non-experimentally using observational data. We've looked at the spread of obesity, the spread of smoking, the spread of emotional states. I mean, we've done a ton of work in this area. And, unsurprisingly, to different extents, most of these social phenomena, most human behaviors, not shockingly, manifest, evidence of social contagion. And I wouldn't take it to be, social contagion, it shouldn't have a negative or positive valence. It's just a property of human beings. It's a property of our species. We copy what others around us are doing, and therefore we can come to copy what people we don't even know are doing. So, for example, you don't have COVID right now, and neither do your friends, but there's a friend's friend who has COVID, and that pathogen is going to wind its way inexorably to you. Therefore, your fate depends on what's happening among these people you don't even know, your friends, whether they're infected or not, for instance. And it's not just their infection status with respect to pathogens that affects you. It's all kinds of other things. Whether they lose their job, for instance, will affect you, or whether they quit smoking will affect you, or whether they are kind and altruistic. So we did some experiments that showed that if Tom is kind to Dick, then Dick will be kind to Harry, and Harry will be kind to Betty, and Betty will be kind to Sue. So how Betty treats Sue depends on how Tom treated Dick, even though neither Betty nor Sue ever saw or interacted with Tom or Dick. And we've shown this experimentally in a paper we published in 2010 and many subsequent papers. So, we can document social contagion and altruistic behavior, for example. So many behavior, I would say almost all, it's a rebuttable presumption that any behavior will be prone to social contagion, subject to us going and looking and seeing. Not every behavior does, but as a first order, you can assume that it will until proven otherwise.
It's an interesting linguistic bias that the negative ones stand out in my head, but I think it's because if you look at the published literature, as you mentioned, it is a valence neutral social learning process, the same phenomena, but they often talk about imitation or cultural learning, like if it's positive. And I've only generally seen social contagion for things like smoking or cutting or body image disorders, especially among adolescent girls. That's a big research literature.
Yeah, you're right. Many of the examples are taken to have negative valence, but it's studiousness will spread from person to person in adolescence. So if your friends are nerdy, you'll become more nerdy. And safe sex practices, condom use. If your friends use condoms, it'll make you use condoms. So, or not deterministically, it's not going to guarantee that you use condoms, but there'll be some positive effect. So, but you're right. I think often wrongly, in my view, people think of negative things with negative valence spreading with social contagion, but I don't think that needs to be our posture. The fundamental point is that things spread in human populations. We evolved for that to be the case.
Now, even if we don't know precisely what's going on in the brain, it seems pretty well established that adolescents are more prone to some types of social contagion effect. Some
They
have
are.
argued girls especially. Why is that?
I don't know the reason. I could speculate. You could say that developmentally adolescents are practicing living socially as adults, so learning to copy what others around you are doing is some advantage. Or you could say that you're that there's power in numbers. So lots of people doing the same thing is beneficial. You could say that that it's a kind of social signaling. This is my tribe, so I'm going to do what my tribe does. There's a long history of people. If you want to signal your membership in a tribe, demand that people adhere to things that are manifestly false. if you're outside and it's raining and you say that it's raining, then you're not signaling membership in any group other than the group that's able to reason about the world, to speak the truth. But if you want to signal, I'm a member of this tribe, then say there's a God that throws lightning bolts from Mount Olympus, and we can't see this God. We can't prove that he exists, but he throws lightning bolts from Mount Olympus. That's a way to signal membership in a particular group by professing things that are not provably true or false. So, uh, uh, so, so maybe adolescence, this period of adolescence is related to that. Like some kind of group membership signaling, that adolescents are learning to cope with. So I don't know the reason why, adolescents are so especially prone to copy each other and not, um, well, keep in mind, they often want to not copy their parents. Although even there, the literature is interesting, by the way. Actually, if you ask adolescents, who do they care, whose opinion do they really care the most about, it is typically still their parents. I mean, they want to listen to the music their friends are listening to and wear what their friends are wearing and all of that stuff. But they do care what their parents think, which is also makes sense. Like Icarus and Daedalus. Daedalus says, don't fly near the sun. And Icarus ignores his father and dies. This is a morality, play. This is a story that is meant to communicate the dangers of not listening to your parents when you're a hubristic and naive adolescent.
So there's some overlap between the type of signaling that you mentioned, especially if it's costly signaling. I was thinking about virtue signaling, and I was also thinking about the evolutionary handicapping idea. You see that in sexual selection with physiological traits, but then I guess there's also this idea that even psychologically, could you hold information? This is kind of related to Rob Henderson's luxury belief idea.
I mean, there's arguments about how adolescent boys behaving stupidly is a signal of fitness, of physical fitness and survivability. I don't know the status of that literature. I think these are ideas worth considering. I think to the extent we can experimentally test them, we should. Rob Henderson's idea of luxury beliefs is a magnificent idea, but specifically that idea I think is a very culturally or historically specific idea, which is, that a luxury belief is a belief that elites hold that confers status on them, but imposes costs on those below them. So, for example, he uses the example of defund the police. If I'm rich, I can hire my own private police force. So I say defund the police. That's a luxury belief for me because the victims of crime are more likely to be not me, going to be poor people. But I'm not sure that there are evolutionary predicates to this, in terms of beliefs. I mean, I'd have to think about it. Maybe there are.
So I guess the cost would be incurred on everyone, but it's that rich people can afford to bear that cost. So then the harm ends up being disproportionately
Either the costs are imposed on everyone or not on everyone. But either way, I can hold this belief that doesn't harm me or doesn't harm me as much as it harms those below me. But I think generally these beliefs don't harm me. These luxury beliefs is the idea. I suppose you're right. Like defund the police. Like I should recognize that if I'm rich and I say defund the police, that maybe that could also harm me. But it harms others even more. So that's what makes it count as a luxury belief.
So a good place to close would be maybe any set of heuristics you have for testing whether something is actually testable. Like if you're proposing a theory about something is socially contagion or socially evolved or is a network-based effect, as opposed to any host of other reasons, of other causes, how can you reliably disentangle those?
Well, in my lab, we've been doing experiments for 20 years. I mean, we've done experiments with field experiments where we randomly assign people to different treatments, different kinds of social contagion treatments, for example, as I said, in Uganda and India and Honduras. with tens and tens of thousands of people. And we've done online experiments with different groups randomly assigned to different sorts of treatments, again, with tens of thousands of people. So, for example, one of the metaphors I like to evoke is the metaphor of carbon. You can take carbon atoms and assemble them one way, and you get graphite, which is soft and dark. Or take the same carbon atoms and assemble them another way, and you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are two key intellectual ideas there. First of all, these properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness are not properties of the carbon atoms. They are properties of the collection of carbon atoms, properties that are emergent properties of carbon. And second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. Take the same carbon atoms and connect them one way, you get one set of properties. Connect them a different way, you get a different set of properties. And in fact, it's the same with human groups. You can take a group of people and you connect them one way, and they are happy and healthy and innovative and cooperative. Or take the same people and maybe even the same number of connections, but arrange those connections differently for those people in a different topology, and the people are unhealthy and uncooperative and unhappy and unable to coordinate their activities. So these properties, let's say, of cooperation or healthiness or happiness, you see, could be emergent properties of human social systems. Your happiness, in other words, is not just a product of your own brain and the structure of your brain and the chemicals in your brain and the hormones in your brain. Your happiness is also a product of the social arrangements around you, which could be manipulated. And we've done that in many experiments where we have used certain software that we've developed where we can create temporary artificial societies of real people and recruit online research subjects by the many thousands and drop them into different worlds where we engineer different social architectures and then test ideas experimentally of this sort. So I would say that, as you know, that the crucial test of a science is it falsifiable? So if you articulate a question, can you also suggest an experiment that, if you were to conduct it, would disprove your belief? If so, that's science. If not, then it's religion or something else. It's not science. And we, at least in my lab, very much try to do that, to try to discover new things about human social interactions, to try to test them empirically, and to try to present them to the rest of the world as beautifully and as elegantly as we can.
That's a great place to close. Thank you very much for your time, Nicholas.
Thank you so much for having me, Adam. It's a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation.